Good afternoon, everybody. Today I will talk not only about speciation models, but I will also try to connect them to even larger evolutionary questions in community ecology. So the second part of my talk will be about evolutionary community assembly. But before delving into all this, I want to revisit some of the questions we have been discussing so far in terms of appropriate classification schemes for speciation processes. And I would like to add a little bit to that discussion. So the traditional classifications of speciation are in geographic terms or in pattern, spatial terms. We have allopatric, parapatric, and sympatric speciation. And more recently, other notions have been added to this, which emphasize the process more than the pattern. And the first of these might have been the competitive speciation notion Michael Rosenzweig introduced, Ulf Schlüter's ecological speciation. Then more in general, one can talk about whether speciation is selection-driven or non-adaptive. And also I will talk later about adaptive speciation. Now these are steps forward, but one should keep in mind that probably for the foreseeable future we will need many classification schemes. So the aim here is not somehow to exclude one at the expense of the others, but to offer a couple of options that suit different research questions and different researchers. One can go a little bit further and put all these on one diagram where we have the pattern dimension on the horizontal axis and the drivers on the vertical axis, where we have sexual selection, which can drive speciation, natural selection, genetic drift. And then we can delineate areas in this diagram where these different processes are most likely to unfold. So for example, allopatric speciation, well, that's a simple one. Whereas, for example, competitive speciation has been envisaged to occur in sympatry only and through natural selection. And then the other big areas are ecological speciation, which is probably more easy to achieve in allopatry or parapatry rather than sympatry, and adaptive speciation, for which it is opposite. It's more easy to achieve in sympatry or in parapatry that's close to sympatry. But even that scheme is maybe too limiting. And that is because speciation has to be appreciated as a multifaceted, multi-layered process where several tiers might build upon each other. And to incorporate this time dimension, I would like to offer yet another way of looking at classifying the processes. And in my opinion, we need to include at least three notions here, which are critical to any speciation. That's ecological differentiation, which provides the only speciation criterion for asexuals. And some people would debate whether one should even talk about species and asexuals, but I decide to do that. And then we have the spatial differentiation, which I think is recognized not only because of the allopatry perspective of old, but also because of the recent emphasis on gradients and on parapatric speciation. And this can either drive or be driven by the speciation process. I will come back to that. And obviously, central stage belongs to reproductive differentiation, which can lead to reproductive isolation or gradual reproductive isolation. And that needs to evolve for speciation and sexuals. So all these characteristics can arise simultaneously or sequentially and occur gradually or in externally determined phases. So it's really quite a complex picture where these three dimensions can unfold concurrently or in sequence, and where we have to take a gradual perspective instead of a binary perspective where this either happens or doesn't happen. And one way to integrate that into one comprehensive visual representation is what I call speciation cubes. So here we have the three dimensions of differentiation: ecological, spatial, and reproductive. And then we put all those on the edges of a cube. So now we have a three-dimensional space, and the origin corresponds to no differentiation. So that's the ancestral state before speciation gets going. And then in this cube we can now delineate trajectories, speciation trajectories, if you will. So for example, we can distinguish between the parts of the trajectories that are non-adaptive, which are either random by genetic drift or externally imposed, and between the adaptive components of the speciation process. So for example, we can say speciation starts with a sudden increase in spatial differentiation by the separation, spatial geographical isolation of two populations. So that could be vicariant speciation, or it could be peripatric speciation. Any kind of allopatric speciation starts like that. And now it can continue, let's say, by local adaptation, which pleiotropically brings about reproductive isolation, and that is indicated by this line here. So we get increased ecological differentiation because of the local adaptation to different habitats, and that entails reproductive differentiation. And once we're at this top plane, we understand we have reproductive isolation. And then we can bring the species back into secondary contact, so we remove the spatial differentiation, and then we have coexisting species in symmetry, but through secondary contact. And we can go through all the discussed models in the literature and see how they are represented in these speciation cubes by trajectories. I will not bore you with the details here, this is just a side remark, but allopatric speciation can be accommodated here, sympatric speciation, and peripatric speciation. And in each case, we can distinguish whether we have the process driven by sexual selection, because that does not necessarily entail ecological differentiation, or by a natural selection, and then usually we would expect ecological differentiation to occur as a part of the speciation process. Let me just draw your attention to slightly more complicated scenarios for which this representation may be most suited. Two phase speciation processes have been discussed. So for example, in the wake of geographic isolation, the incipient species may develop partial reproductive isolation. So here we have the geographic isolation, here we have the partial reproductive isolation, and that can occur through genetic drift, through sexual selection, or through sexual conflict, or through local ecological adaptation, which you see here. So here we have ecological differentiation emerging. And then this first phase is followed by the establishment of secondary contact. So we remove the spatial segregation, the full spatial segregation, and subsequent reinforcement, taking us potentially all the way, or at least close to, reproductive isolation. And if you care, then it may also interest you that Dolf Schlüter's double invasion scenario, which he has advanced as an explanation for what happens in those North American sticklebacks, can also be understood in those terms. So my suggestion is that for some occasions and for some questions, these speciation cubes might transcend those old dichotomies and may allow us to construct a more comprehensive and more gradual view of the process-based elements of speciation. Now let me get to the real part of my talk, which is structured in two sections. In the first, I would like to introduce the notion of adaptive speciation to you in its three facets, for asexuals, sexuals, and in spatial settings. And then in the second part, I would like to extend this to understanding the structure and emergence of ecological communities. So, in order to have speciation in sexuals, obviously we need the evolution of reproductive isolation, and one way to get that is divergent selection. So you have two subpopulations which, because of some accident, experience different contravening selection pressures in different parts, in different demes. And then you may get reproductive isolation as a byproduct of local adaptation. So first local adaptation occurs, and then potentially pleiotropically or through genetic drift, reproductive isolation ensues, maybe or maybe not. Probably more powerful, but not necessarily more prevalent mode is disruptive selection, where there's direct force to pull the unimodal distribution apart and make it bimodal. However, disruptive selection that is frequency independent is quite impotent in driving the evolution of reproductive isolation. And that is because the population has to be purged exactly at a fitness minimum, which is a static fitness landscape, and then one tail has to evolve to become one species, the other tail has to evolve to become the other species. But first of all, the question arises, why would the population become purged at a fitness minimum if it's static? Well, there would have to be some press perturbation or pulse perturbation in the environment that puts it there, which may of course happen. But more worryingly, it's a very unstable situation. Most likely the whole population is either pulled to the left or to the right, but it's not split up. So a much more effective way of splitting a population up is frequency-dependent disruptive selection, because here we have the curious circumstance that if the whole population is to the left of this point in phenotype space, it is driven to the right, and vice versa. And when it is perched on that point, then we have disruptive selection. So it's a kind of self-organized convergence to a fitness minimum. The population is driven to the point where forces then occur to split it apart. And so this disruptive selection is stabilized and thus may be very long-lived, and therefore all the mechanisms that may emerge, be they behavioral, be they plastic, be they genetic, to help the population to escape the fitness minimum, have a long time for developing. So that is then more likely to happen than if we have this singular incident where the population has to respond immediately to the disruptiveness, or either disruptive selection turns directional again. Now this process, which I just described, is called evolutionary branching, and that was introduced already 18 years ago. And I would like to draw an analogy to what Richard Feynman said about quantum physics. He said, if you are not constantly surprised throughout your life about quantum physics, you haven't understood it. And I think with evolutionary branching, it's a little bit the same. It's such a weird phenomenon, and I think most people, most of us, remain surprised and need to remain surprised by this strange macroevolutionary phenomenon. So we have a fitness landscape, the yellow curve here, in a one-dimensional phenotype space. The red circle indicates where the population currently is. And as you can see, fitness increases to the left, so therefore the population follows this directional selection pressure and evolves to the left. But then the fitness landscape changes due to frequency-dependent selection. Now we have this fitness landscape. Still, selection points us to the left, but when the population follows that pressure, it eventually finds itself located at a fitness minimum, trapped at a fitness minimum, because if it moves to the right, it's returned to the left. If it moves to the left, it's returned to the right. So it cannot escape this fitness minimum. So what we have here is convergence of a population to being trapped at the fitness minimum. And that makes it so weird. I think if one is trained to think about selection in terms of fixed fitness landscape, this seems entirely loony. And therefore the question arises, what are the ecological or eco-evolutionary mechanisms that could cause such selection pressures? And as it turns out, and that's what we have understood over the last 15 years or so, they are quite generic. It doesn't take much to create these scenarios. So resource competition was the first mechanism, or first class of mechanisms, to be explored. And the models go back to MacArthur, May, and Rosenzweig, late 70s, early 80s, or even actually late 60s. And these models consider a resource axis, not spatial, just a resource axis. One-dimensional phenotype space, not all resources are equally abundant, so we consider a unimodal part of the distribution. If it's multimodal, we consider a unimodal part. And then we consider competition, which is strongest when individuals are specialized on the same resource. So a consumer specialized on this resource has strong competition a little bit to the left and to the right, but very little competition with consumers further away. So that suffices to get evolutionary branching. And evolutionary branching has also been shown to occur in evolutionary models driven by other selection pressures. Actually, all three fundamental types of ecological interactions can cause evolutionary branching, including predator-prey interactions, or more generally exploiter-victim interactions, mutualistic interactions, and then also mate competition. So this links to sexual selection. Now, this can be put into an asexual model, into a sexual model, into a spatial model, and I will get to that quickly. I just want to draw your attention to the large score of studies that has by now been published about different evolutionary ecological questions tackled through an analysis of evolutionary branching. So probably we are talking about some 60 or maybe even 80 papers that have been published. You cannot read this, you should not read this, but just to give you an idea, this is a brief bibliography of publications on evolutionary branching. So this has helped to analyze all sorts of questions ranging from anisogamy to food web evolution and so on. Okay, now I quickly unfold this into the 3 dimensions, asexual, sexual, spatial, without going into too much detail. So an asexual population can be implemented in a model very easily with phenotypic models, individual-based. Here you have the time axis, there you have the phenotype. This colored cloud indicates the density of individuals in phenotype space, and you see that first the population converges to the maximum of the resource distribution, to the maximum of the green curve. So that's clear, that's where most resources are. But once everybody is there, we get disruptive selection, because then we have high competition for these resources, and it becomes advantageous to branch out literally and to exploit the tails of the resource distribution where there's less competition. I would like to connect that to the earlier notion of competitive speciation introduced by Michael Rosenzweig as early as '78. And I would like to take the time to read out to you some sentences from his '95 book. Competitive speciation is the expansion of a species from a single ecological opportunity to an unexploited ecological opportunity, followed by that species' sympatric breakup into 2 daughters, one using the original opportunity, the other the newly exploited one. Both the expansion and the breakup come apart because of competition. The expansion happens because of lack of competition to use the unexploited ecological opportunity, whereas the breakup happens because of too much competitive pressure on phenotypes in between those best able to exploit the old and the new opportunities. So he conceived this in terms of 2 niches, like a bimodal fitness landscape where the population starts on one mode and then colonizes the other mode. So that's quite different from what I have shown you so far. But when you continue reading his explanation, you see it's the same mechanism at work, the same idea. So a phenotype that sits on peak A does well and increases to a steady state. Natural selection then forces it to expand its variance to exploit the unused ecological opportunity. Remember, he thinks of 2 fitness peaks. It produces mid-range individuals in between the 2 peaks, and they produce individuals specialized on the second peak B. Then the combination of peak A and peak B phenotypes exert competitive pressure on the sparse resources of the middle habitats of the niche axis. Then and only then do the mid-range individuals become unfit, no matter how few they are. So it's a suppression of the mid-range individuals that's the core idea here, and that's exactly the same idea as evolutionary branching. Okay, let's extend this to sexual populations. We did that some 10 years ago. For that you need to bring into the model the evolution of reproductive isolation. And the way we did that, so actually I should say first, with random mating and additive multilocus genetics, sexual populations cannot easily become bimodal. You can force them to become bimodal by extremely strong disruptive selection, but that is not realistic. So for sexual populations, we need, in addition for ecological divergence to happen, we need the evolution of reproductive isolation, because otherwise the hybrids always fill the gap. Population tries to split up, but the hybrids fill the gap. And thus we allowed evolution of the mating mode. We introduced a second character in addition to the ecological character, which could range between +1 and -1, with 0 corresponding to random mating. So we allowed gradual evolution of the assortment. And here's what we get. We see again, even though we now have a multilocus model with diploid inheritance and sexual reproduction, we get a split of the population into 2 modes. And this goes hand in hand, is only enabled by the evolution of assortative mating. So only because assortative mating emerges can the split occur. Okay, we can extend this one step further now to a parapatric setting. So again, we see along a gradient, which we are now considering, the splitting of the population into 2 modes. But now we can talk about the pattern as well as about the process. And we find that when we compare the spatial location and the phenotypes of individuals, we find a pattern of abutment. Instead of the gradient getting filled continuously, we find one species exploiting the lower part of the gradient, one species exploiting the other part, the upper part, and they have a primary hybrid zone in between. Now here spatial segregation is the consequence the consequence, rather than the cause of speciation. And that makes the whole interpretation of biogeographic patterns much more interesting and much more complicated. I don't want to go into too much details, but in addition to the abutment, which we found surprising when we started this, there were two further surprises. One was that even in populations where without gradients there would be no branching, the gradient alone introduced a selective force towards branching. And the second surprise was that gradients of intermediate slope were most prone, most readily given rise to the speciation process. Now, coming back to the biogeographic pattern and interpreting their signatures, here I have adopted a diagram and, from publication by Barraclough and Vogler, 2000, where they compared in an empirical analysis the age of a species pair in terms of their genetic distance with the geographic overlap of that species pair. So you would expect that after a long while, the overlap of the species pairs becomes randomized and converges to some asymptotic level. But if speciation starts out sympatrically, then for young species pairs, you expect high overlap. So these dots are now species pairs. And if speciation primarily occurs allopatrically, then for young species pairs you expect low overlap, and eventually both curves converge. So that seems like a neat pattern to look out for. But the trouble is, if you plot in that same diagram what you expect from the model I just described, then you expect this. Very quickly, on a time scale you can probably not detect in the fossil record usually, the spatial segregation is established. So together with ecological differentiation along the gradient, the segregation occurs, abutment arises, and therefore the signature of such a process looks probably more like that of an allopatric process than that of a sympatric process. So this should caution us to rely all too much on analysis of this kind, because we may be led astray. Okay, I will briefly mention further investigations without spending too much time on this. We have looked at spatial self-structuring without gradients, and that can both help and hinder speciation. We have looked at dispersal evolution, and then you don't even need assortative mating because the evolution of philopatry gives you effective assortative mating in local, because individuals meet with local kin. We have conditional dispersal evolved in such models, and that also helps. And we have random patchiness, and you heard a little bit about that from Ben in his talk yesterday. So you can extend these models quite easily in all sorts of directions, and I don't have the time to go into that. Rather, I would like to run very quickly through a few discussion points. Because these models have now received a high degree of scrutiny, which of course is good to make sure that we have done nothing wrong, and people have looked at initial conditions and mutation rates, at infinitesimal models, at costs of assortative mating, at competition functions, at spatial boundary conditions, and so on. And I don't have the time really to explain all this in great detail, but I would like to tell you a few things here. So one question is, does adaptive speciation occur for altered initial conditions? For example, without the random assignment of alleles in our model. And we find, yes, this is essentially independent of the initial genotype distribution. Also, does adaptive speciation occur for lowered mutation rates? And the answer is yes, unless you make it so low that too much fixation occurs and selection runs out of fuel, which of course easily happens in the relatively low population sizes we can simulate in individual-based models. Next questions. Does adaptive speciation occur in infinitesimal models of quantitative genetics? Because here there is no limitation of the phenotypic range, no boundary effects in phenotype space, so these cannot contribute to disruptive selection. And yes, we had a study 3 years ago that shows it works. It actually works very well because in infinitesimal models you have infinitely extended tails, and they help you to establish bimodal distributions quite effectively. The costs of assortative mating, I think, are one of the most interesting discussion areas. Does adaptive speciation occur despite costs of assortative mating? I would say in my view, the answer is yes, unless the costs of choosiness are too high or the genetic architectures are too rigid. But this is a bit of a subtle issue, so one should not gloss over it too easily. First of all, one should distinguish between two costs of assortative mating: the cost of rarity, which applies to males that are not chosen, and the cost of choosiness, which applies to females that delay mating for too long by being very choosy. And we looked at all these possibilities, and we found in various models that adaptive speciation can occur. But again, this is a more subtle story. But in infinitesimal models, the story is quite easy, because then all that the costs of assortative mating are doing is they shift the evolved assortment from very high to intermediate. So they prevent the evolution of very high assortment. That's exactly what you expect from costs to do. But in models that are more complex, with multi-locus genetics, with finite population sizes, we have heard earlier in this conference, you can have a barrier to the evolution of assortative mating. It goes halfway and then stops, because there is a fitness valley and we cannot proceed with the evolution of assortative mating. So that's why the answer is not always easy. Under certain circumstances, costs of assortment can stop the evolution of reproductive isolation. Two other aspects which point to broader areas of investigation are competition functions. We have used, following Roughgarden and Rosenzweig, Roughgarden and MacArthur and May, we have used Gaussian functions. These are known to be structurally unstable when you plug them into deterministic models. But since we use stochastic models, that doesn't apply. So actually in our models, this problem does not occur. And this is actually a very important general point. These Gaussian competition models, they seem so attractive. You want to have a unimodal function, you pick a Gaussian. Sounds great, but it's exactly a structurally unstable choice. It's a very pathological case, so one should be very careful about it. But as soon as one combines it with some elements of realism, like resource heterogeneity, demographic stochasticity, or within polymorphism, the problem goes away. So it's only a problem in highly simplified deterministic models, but in those models one can be led astray. And finally, people have asked whether the boundary conditions, the spatial boundary conditions in these models matter. And the answer is, well, they matter a little bit, but actually the branching process goes through even if you have infinitely extended ranges without any boundaries, or when you have periodic boundaries, or when you have reflective boundaries, or when you have absorbing boundaries. So for all these processes, the spatial adaptive speciation works just as well. Okay, now the second part, evolutionary community assembly, much shorter. And I would like to start with drawing your attention to one thing that might be regarded as a paradigm shift in community ecology. And that is the shift from cataloging the unfathomable, I would say, complexity and diversity of species by constructing shared trait spaces, by focusing on so-called functional traits. That's a term that's particularly popular now in plant ecology, functional traits, and putting all the species in a community into a shared trait space. So that's a powerful paradigm, and suddenly you can cut through all the bewildering complexity that otherwise obstructs a more conceptual understanding of community dynamics. So there was an influential paper here in Tree by other people, we were not involved here, 2006, Rebuilding Community Ecology from Functional Traits. I recommend that, very good reading. Now let me run you very quickly through the two trait situation. So assume that we have functional traits, and now we have a bivariate trait space. And now we make the same assumptions as before, a unimodal resource distribution and a unimodal competition function. But now everything is in 2 dimensions. So this is a unimodal resource distribution. Here we have the unimodal competition function. And now we can look at this from a community assembly point of view. We can assemble this by random immigration, or actually we can start with a random community and then selection weeds out unfit species. And what you are then retaining are these species indicated here in black. So this is a two-dimensional trait space on the horizontal plane. Fitness is vertical. The dark shades are negative fitness. The light shades are positive fitness. So all remaining species are sitting on the shoreline because they are stable. They are neither shrinking nor increasing. And nevertheless, we have peaks, unexploited peaks of the fitness landscape where with further immigration, colonization could occur. So random assembly is quite inefficient actually. Even if you start with very many species, it's quite inefficient in filling a community so that no further invasion can occur. Now let's add to this gradual evolution. Gradual evolution helps a lot because now the species climb up the shoreline towards their nearest peak, and eventually each species ends up as a king of its little hill, and around it, fitness is negative, so this is an evolutionary steady state, but still, we would usually find peaks sticking out of the seascape and allowing colonization. But then if we introduce also speciation, then community closure becomes possible. So speciation, I believe, is very potent next to immigration and gradual evolution in allowing communities to fill up the niches they are provided with and they are partly generated. Now we can go back to the univariate case and instead of having symmetric competition, make competition slightly asymmetric. And then you get these taxon cycles. So if you show this, here's evolutionary time, there's the trait. If you show this, if you would find this in the fossil record, I think everybody would surmise this is driven by environmental noise, or rather trends, by environmental trends. But this is completely driven by the internal eco-evolutionary dynamics of the community. So this is just one example how very simple ingredients, asymmetric competition, can generate quite complex, quite rich eco-evolutionary patterns that are akin to what people have discussed under the term taxon cycles. Yeah, just a few glimpses. Again, we can make evolution bivariate. So in a univariate evolutionary setting, we would often see a tree that just fans out and then stops. But if we add a second trait that is under weak directional selection, everything changes. Then we get these much more complex and actually more naturally looking trees where branches are dying out and new branches are constantly regenerated. So again, very simple ingredients, frequency-dependent selection in the horizontal dimension, and then weak directional selection in another dimension, and that generates such complex phylogenetic trees in these asexual models. Okay, and then closing with two more data-oriented applications. I would like to show you our work on evolutionary food web assembly, but that will actually be shown in detail by Orke, so I can easily skip that. This is the emergence of food webs through adaptive radiation. So I can go to our evolutionary ecology work with plant ecologist colleagues from Australia. So there we have calibrated an ecophysiological model to describe let's say, Australian plant ecological settings. And there we find that in such a model, we have these two functional traits, leaf mass per area, that's basically the density of leaves, and the height at maturation, that's when they start to reproduce. We see evolution towards a global evolutionary attractor. So that seems like a best trait, but then the community can split up. And I show you on one slide what then happens. Then you actually get a complex canopy evolving, which, at least to our plant ecologists, looks fairly realistic, fairly close to what they observe. We can have one species, two species, three species, up to 5 species, which comes out of this carefully calibrated eco-physiological model. And then, last application, corrigonate diversification along a temperature depth gradient. That's work done with Jan Ohlberger. In a lake close to Berlin, 2 fish species, corrigonates have been found, Vendes and Fontana Cisco, and we integrated what was known about the ecology and physiology, temperature-dependent rates and all that into a model. And here on the next slide you see all the functions that we have estimated from data. Then we crank the handle and see what diversification this engenders, and we find indeed stratification of two forms that is very similar to what we find in nature. So these two forms, one is on the more shallow parts of the lake, one is in the deeper and colder parts of the lake, and even the depth at which they are primarily observed are accurately reproduced by the model. So with that, I come to the summary. So I hope I have shown you that frequency-dependent disruptive selection is indeed a powerful agent of adaptive diversification, but I think in this audience nobody is doubting that anyway. The evolution of reproductive isolation at evolutionary branching points can cause adaptive speciation in sexual populations. Also maybe no longer very surprising, but 10 years ago that was quite a big surprise. Spatial gradients greatly facilitate adaptive speciation, with intermediate gradient slopes being most speciation prone. And moreover, spatial segregation can be shown to be the consequence rather than the cause of speciation. So that, I think, requires a fundamental rethinking of how we interpret extent by geographic patterns. And finally, in the last part, oops, something wrong with the slides here. In the last part, I hope I have shown you that the community perspectives resulting from this are quite exciting, and I think this is vastly unexplored territory. So by integrating empirical knowledge about population dynamics, we can make evolutionary predictions about community structures, and I think there's a lot of exciting work that still has to be done here. Thank you very much.
Back to your speciation model, one can show that if you constrain genetic variance, so that is narrow relative to the equilibrium distribution, then you can get speciation. Do you understand what happens in the sympathetic speciation model if you expand the phenotypic range?
Yeah, indeed. That is following from what I mentioned about the infinitesimal model. The infinitesimal model has no range, so the phenotypes could go as far up or down as they like. And there we know from this analysis in 2007 that branching still occurs. So I remember that you were in a publication writing that this constraint of the phenotypic range can contribute to the disruptive selection, and I think that's right. But it's not necessary for the evolutionary branching to occur.
It's the constraint of the variance. So if you, in the infinitesimal model, if you increase the variance as you would let the variance increase in the sexual model, that do you know what will happen there? Because I would expect that.
Yeah, sure. If you limit the variance, actually that would help the evolutionary branching. So one can argue how likely is it that how likely is it that a population spreads out so much that it covers a whole resource distribution? And probably that's not very likely if the resource distribution is broad, so that enhances further the pressure towards specialization.
Further questions? Okay, no, let's